20 years ago, Nathaniel Cross laid the last bouquet of flowers on the grave of the woman he believed had died in a horrifying accident. He never took off his wedding ring. He never allowed himself to love anyone else, not once. Not even when people who cared about him quietly suggested it might be time. Then, on a rain-soaked afternoon at the end of autumn, inside an old train station, he saw that same woman step off a train. Beside her stood a young woman with eyes that were unmistakably his own. For a moment, Nathaniel thought he was looking at a ghost, some fracture of memory finally breaking loose after 20 years of careful containment. But the truth waiting for him was far more unsettling than a ghost, because both of them, the woman and the girl beside her, were staring directly back at him, as though they had been expecting this moment for a very long time. In a quiet corner of an American town, where the leaves turned gold and fell in slow, tired spirals onto the sidewalks, Nathaniel Cross lived a life shaped entirely by repetition. He owned a small workshop on a street lined with maple trees, a place where he restored antique clocks, an old brick building with a bell above the door that rang softly whenever someone entered. Every morning he opened at exactly 8 o'clock, setting his tools out in the same order they had occupied for years, wiping down the same wooden counter with the same worn cloth. Every evening he closed at exactly 6, locking the door behind him and walking home along the same 3 streets, regardless of weather. His hands, calloused and precise, moved through gears and springs with a patience that seemed almost meditative, as though fixing broken machines was the only way he knew how to keep himself from breaking too. Customers admired his skill, driving from neighboring towns to have him restore watches passed down through generations. Pocket clocks, inherited from grandfathers, mantelpieces that had stopped keeping time decades earlier. They spoke of him with quiet respect, calling him a craftsman, a perfectionist, a man who treated broken things with more gentleness than most people treated the living. Few of them ever learned anything real about the man behind it, about the silence he carried home each night, about the empty side of the bed he had never once filled with anyone else. He answered questions about his life with short, practiced deflections, enough to satisfy politeness without ever inviting anyone closer. He lived alone in a house that still held traces of a life interrupted. A coat that no one wore hanging by the door. A coffee mug on a shelf that had not moved in 2 decades. A closet in the second bedroom that he had never once opened since the year Eleanor disappeared from his life. Friends had once encouraged him to move on, to sell the house, to date again, to let the past settle into memory rather than routine, and for a while their concern had come often and gently, the way concern does when people still believe words might change something. He listened to all of it politely. And then he changed nothing. And eventually, even the most persistent voices around him learned to stop asking. Every month, without fail, he visited a cemetery on the edge of town, where a modest headstone bore the name Eleanor Cross, framed by 2 old oak trees that dropped their leaves across the grass each autumn. He replaced the flowers himself, kneeling in the damp earth with the quiet devotion of a man who had never learned how to stop, brushing dirt from the letters of her name with the same careful attention he gave to the smallest gears in his workshop. He spoke to her sometimes, quietly, about nothing important. About the weather, or a difficult repair, or a customer who had reminded him of something she once said. He never once suspected that the woman he spoke to in that cemetery had never actually been buried beneath the ground he knelt upon. The people in his life had long since accepted that Eleanor's death was a closed chapter. A tragedy from 20 years past, involving a train accident that had taken her from him without warning. One of those stories towns absorb quietly and rarely mention again. Amelia Rowan, who ran an art gallery downtown and had known Nathaniel for nearly 15 years, often worried about him more than she let on. She brought him dinner on nights she suspected he had forgotten to eat, leaving containers on his porch without knocking when she sensed he wanted solitude more than company. She sat with him in silence when words felt unnecessary, understanding instinctively that comfort sometimes meant simply staying rather than speaking. She loved him in a way she had never spoken aloud, aware that his heart belonged to someone who existed only in photographs now. And she had made peace, or something close to it, with loving a man who could not love her back the same way. On an ordinary afternoon, Gray light filtering weakly through the workshop windows. The bell above the door rang, and a stranger stepped inside. He was an older man with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression, dressed as though he had walked out of a courtroom rather than off the street. His coat too formal for the weather, his posture too deliberate for a casual visit. He did not ask about clocks. He did not browse the shelves lined with pocket watches and mantelpieces in various stages of repair. He simply looked at Nathaniel for a long moment, as if measuring something invisible between them. Something only he seemed able to see. And then he spoke a single sentence before turning to leave. "Some people who die," he said, "are not actually dead." The door closed behind him before Nathaniel could ask what he meant, the bell ringing once more into the sudden silence of the shop, and the words settled into the workshop like dust that refused to fall, drifting through Nathaniel's thoughts for days afterward, no matter how hard he tried to dismiss them as the ramblings of a strange old man. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself the same thing every night for a week, and every night the sentence returned anyway. Quiet and persistent, refusing to be forgotten. A week later, Nathaniel traveled across town to deliver a restored pocket watch to a client who lived near the old train station. A place he rarely visited because of what it represented to him, the last place he had ever spoken to Eleanor before the accident that took her. The platform was crowded that afternoon, commuters moving in every direction beneath a thin curtain of rain, umbrellas bobbing like dark flowers above the crowd, the announcement system crackling overhead with departures and delays. He stood near the ticket booth, watching the arrivals board flicker with new numbers, the watch wrapped carefully in his coat pocket, when something in the corner of his vision made him stop breathing entirely. A woman had turned her head toward him from across the platform, and for one suspended second, the entire world seemed to lose its sound. The announcements fading, the footsteps disappearing, the rain itself seeming to pause mid-fall. It was Eleanor, not a memory of her, not a resemblance, but her actual face, older by 20 years yet somehow untouched by the passage of time in the ways that mattered most. The same slight tilt of her head, the same careful stillness in her shoulders. Nathaniel's hands went cold around the small box he was carrying, and his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him, because the woman standing 30 feet away was supposed to be buried beneath a headstone he visited every single month. Her eyes held the same quiet intensity he remembered from their wedding day, the same searching expression she used to give him across crowded rooms when she wanted to leave a party early without saying so aloud. Her posture carried the same careful stillness she always had in crowded places, a way of holding herself that made her seem both present and slightly apart from everything around her. Nathaniel's legs would not move at first, his entire body frozen somewhere between disbelief and a desperate, aching hope that refused to be reasoned with, no matter how impossible the sight in front of him seemed. Beside her stood a young woman, who could not have been older than 22, dressed in a plain wool coat. Her expression calm in a way that felt almost rehearsed, a composure that seemed unusual for someone standing in the middle of a crowded, noisy station. Nathaniel's gaze moved to her face and then, involuntarily, to her eyes, and something inside his chest folded in on itself, the box in his hands nearly slipping from his fingers. Those eyes were his, not similar to his, not reminiscent of his, but identical in shape and color to the ones he saw in the mirror every morning of his life. A detail so precise it felt like looking at his own reflection wearing a stranger's face. He opened his mouth and said Eleanor's name into the noise of the station, his voice cracking in a way he had not allowed it to crack in 20 years. The single word carrying 2 decades of buried grief inside it. The woman's face changed instantly, fear replacing whatever composure she had carried a moment before, her eyes widening, her hand reaching immediately for the young woman beside her. She grabbed the girl's arm and pulled her toward the far end of the platform, moving quickly through the crowd without looking back, weaving between commuters with practiced urgency. Nathaniel moved without thinking, pushing through the crowd, calling her name again. Louder this time, ignoring the startled glances of strangers around him, who could not understand why a grown man was shouting a dead woman's name across a train platform. He reached the end of the platform within seconds, his heart pounding against his ribs like something trying to escape, his breath ragged from the sudden effort. rain soaking into his shoulders as he ran. But when he turned the corner where the two women had disappeared, there was nothing there but an empty hallway and the fading echo of footsteps on wet concrete. No trace of them anywhere, as though the station itself had swallowed them whole. He stood there for a long time after that, rain misting through an open vent above him, his reflection faint and broken in the polished metal of a departures screen, his own face staring back at him, looking older and more haunted than he remembered ever looking before. He told himself it was impossible, that grief could conjure faces out of strangers, that 20 years of unresolved mourning could make a man see things that were not real, that his mind had simply constructed the resemblance out of longing rather than fact. But he had seen her eyes. He had seen his own eyes staring back at him from a stranger's face, and no amount of rational explanation could quiet the storm those two facts had created inside him, a storm that followed him home and refused to settle for even a single hour that night. In the days that followed, Nathaniel could not return to his normal rhythm, the careful order of his workshop feeling suddenly meaningless against the weight of what he had witnessed. He began quietly investigating, searching public records for any trace of Eleanor Cross that might explain what he had witnessed, some administrative error, some long-lost relative he had never known about, anything that might offer a rational explanation for a face that should not have existed. What he found instead was nothing at all. There was no updated record of her, no passport renewal, no medical file, no employment history beyond the year of her supposed death, no trail of any kind, stretching forward from that final documented moment. It was as though the woman had never existed past that single point in time, frozen permanently at the age of 22. The exact moment the world told him she had died, her entire legal existence terminating in the same year as the accident, and never resuming again in any system he could access. He drove to the courthouse where her death certificate had been filed 2 decades earlier, hoping to find some clerical detail he had missed the first time, some overlooked footnote that might explain the impossible sighting at the station. The clerk who helped him seemed uneasy the longer he asked questions, glancing repeatedly toward a supervisor's office, as though hoping someone else might intervene. Eventually, the clerk admitted that certain portions of the file had been sealed under a legal request he was not authorized to discuss, a detail that sent a fresh wave of unease through Nathaniel's chest. Nathaniel pressed for a name, refusing to leave until he received something more than vague deflection, and the clerk, glancing around the room as though someone might be listening, finally offered one. Julian Mercer, a well-known attorney, whose name Nathaniel vaguely recognized from local legal circles. A man rumored to specialize in cases that required absolute discretion, the kind of lawyer people hired when they needed problems to disappear quietly and permanently. Julian did not wait to be found. He appeared at Nathaniel's workshop only 2 days later, stepping through the door with the same unreadable calm the stranger had carried weeks before, though this time Nathaniel recognized something familiar in his face, an old photograph glimpsed once at Eleanor's funeral, a lawyer who had handled her estate all those years ago. Julian's first words were not a greeting. His expression grave, his voice low and deliberate. He told Nathaniel, quietly and firmly, to stop searching for her. Nathaniel asked why, his patience thin after weeks of confusion, demanding some explanation for a warning that only deepened his suspicion rather than easing it. Julian offered no explanation, only a warning wrapped in the practiced diplomacy of a man accustomed to protecting secrets that were not his own to share, repeating that some doors were better left closed for everyone's sake. Rather than deterring him, the encounter deepened Nathaniel's suspicion into something closer to certainty, the lawyer's careful evasiveness only confirming that something significant was being hidden from him. He began watching Julian's movements with the same patience he applied to repairing delicate machinery, noting the attorney's routines, his office hours, the bank he frequented every month on the same date without fail. It was through a records request, one that took considerable effort and a favor from an old friend in finance, that Nathaniel discovered something impossible to ignore. For 20 consecutive years, Julian Mercer had authorized a recurring transfer to an account under a name Nathaniel did not recognize, a payment that had never once missed a month since the year Eleanor supposedly died, arriving with the same unwavering consistency as a heartbeat. The discovery sat in Nathaniel's mind for days, refusing to resolve into any explanation that did not point toward the one possibility he had barely allowed himself to consider. Desperate for answers, Nathaniel made a decision he never imagined himself capable of making. Late one evening, when he knew Julian's office would be empty, he let himself inside using a spare key he had once been given for an unrelated legal matter years earlier, his conscience arguing against the choice, even as his hands moved forward with it anyway. The office was quiet, lit only by the amber glow of a street lamp through the window, rows of filing cabinets standing like silent sentinels along the walls. Nathaniel moved through them with the same careful precision he used on antique gears, searching for anything that might explain the transfers. The sealed records, the woman on the platform who wore his dead wife's face. In a locked drawer at the back of a private cabinet, hidden behind years of unrelated case files, he found a box far heavier than its size suggested. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, bound loosely in stacks with rubber bands that had begun to crack with age, the paper yellowed slightly at the edges from years spent in darkness. He counted later, in disbelief, more than 300 separate letters, all written in the same handwriting he recognized instantly as Eleanor's, the same careful slant she had always used, the same small looping signature at the bottom of every page. None of them had ever been mailed. None of them bore a stamp or an address. Only her handwriting filling page after page with words meant for him and never delivered. Each one began the exact same way, with 4 words that broke something open inside his chest the moment he read them. Nathan, if you ever read this. He sat on the floor of that office for over an hour, reading letter after letter by the dim light of his phone. Each page a fragment of a life he had never known continued to exist, a parallel existence, unfolding somewhere he had never been allowed to see. She wrote about missing him during holidays, describing empty rooms and quiet evenings spent thinking of traditions they used to share. She wrote about a small apartment in a city she never named directly. Careful, even in private letters, never to reveal exactly where she had gone. She wrote about fear, about running, about a decision she had made to protect him from something she never fully explained on paper. Always stopping just short of the details that might have made everything clear. Nathaniel wept quietly in that office, the sound swallowed by the thick carpet and heavy silence. Grief and fury tangled together in a way he had no language for. 20 years of assumed loss, suddenly rewritten into 20 years of deliberate absence. The final letter in the box was dated only a few years back, shorter than the others, written in a hand that trembled slightly at the edges, the handwriting less steady than in the earlier pages. It contained no elaborate explanation, no apology, only a single sentence that Nathaniel read over and over, until the words blurred together on the page. "She's grown now," it said. Nothing more. No context, no name attached. And yet the meaning arrived instantly and completely. Nathaniel understood immediately who the letter meant, and the realization landed in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into every corner of the life he thought he understood, reshaping 2 decades of memory in a single silent moment. From that night forward, Nathaniel could not stop thinking about the young woman who had stood beside Eleanor at the station, the one with his eyes, the one whose existence rewrote everything he believed about the family he thought he had lost. He began a quiet search through public institutions, museums, universities, anywhere a young woman with an unusual gift for history might be employed, searching methodically the way he searched for missing components in a broken clock. Eventually he found her. Vivian Hart worked as a junior curator at a small historical museum downtown, specializing in restoration work not unlike his own, though her focus rested on preserved manuscripts rather than mechanical clocks. She was composed in every photograph he found of her, poised in a way that seemed unusual for someone so young. As though she carried the weight of knowledge far beyond her years, her expression steady even in candid images taken during museum events. For several weeks, Nathaniel found reasons to walk past the museum, to linger near its entrance, to sit on a bench across the street pretending to read while watching the door, unable to stop himself despite the discomfort of his own behavior. He told himself he only wanted to understand, not to interfere, though the truth was more complicated than that, a tangled mixture of longing and fear that made every approach feel impossible. Twice he approached the building, intending to speak with her. And twice, his courage failed him at the last possible moment, his hand freezing on the door handle, while old fears about disrupting whatever fragile peace she had built kept him rooted in place. He walked away both times without a word, cursing his own hesitation the entire way home, wondering how a man who had spent 20 years grieving could suddenly become too afraid to face the truth waiting patiently on the other side of a glass door. It was Vivienne, in the end, who ended the standoff between them. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, she stepped out of the museum earlier than usual and walked directly toward the bench where Nathaniel sat, not with hesitation but with the calm certainty of someone who had been expecting this conversation for a long time. She stopped in front of him and asked, without preamble, whether he had been following her because of her mother. Nathaniel felt the air leave his lungs entirely, unable to form a response, his silence answering the question more clearly than words ever could, his face betraying everything he had tried for weeks to keep hidden. Vivienne sat down beside him on the bench, folding her hands in her lap with the same stillness her mother once carried, and told him plainly that she already knew who he was. She said she had known his face for years, not from memory but from photographs kept carefully in a drawer she was never supposed to find, images she had discovered as a teenager and studied in secret for years afterward. She told him her mother had spoken his name so rarely that when she finally did, it felt less like a confession and more like a wound reopening, a name spoken only in the quietest, most guarded moments. Nathaniel asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether Eleanor was truly her mother, needing to hear the words spoken aloud even after everything the letters had already told him, and Vivienne answered with a single, unwavering yes. Over the following hour, sitting together on that bench as the afternoon light thinned into evening, Vivienne told him a story that rearranged everything Nathaniel believed about his own life. The train accident that had supposedly killed Eleanor 20 years earlier had never happened the way he was told. The entire event constructed carefully to convince an investigation and a grieving husband alike. It had been staged, deliberately and meticulously, to protect her from a dangerous financial organization that had discovered she possessed evidence implicating them in serious crimes. Evidence she had uncovered almost by accident through her work before their marriage. Returning to him, Vivienne explained, would have placed his life in direct danger, since anyone connected to Eleanor would have become a target the moment her survival became known, a risk Eleanor had refused to allow him to carry. Julian Mercer, she continued, had orchestrated the entire disappearance, using his legal connections to fabricate the death certificate, to seal the records, to construct an entirely new identity for Eleanor in a city far from everything she had once known, moving her quietly across state lines under a name that erased every trace of her former life. Vivienne herself had been born only months after Eleanor vanished, growing up without any knowledge of her father's existence until she was old enough to understand the danger her mother had spent her whole life trying to avoid. She described a childhood built around careful rules, unfamiliar cities, and a mother who flinched at loud noises and unfamiliar cars parked too long outside their home. Nathaniel sat in stunned silence through all of it, the pieces of 20 years finally arranging themselves into a shape that made a terrible kind of sense, every strange detail from the past weeks suddenly falling into place like the final gears of a long-broken mechanism. He thought of the stranger in his workshop, the sentence left behind like a warning wrapped in riddle, and understood now that the man had likely been sent, deliberately or not, to nudge him toward a truth someone had decided he was finally ready to face. He thought of the letters, of 300 pages written to a man who would never read them until circumstance forced the drawer open, and felt something close to anger settle beside the grief that had lived in him for 2 decades. When the story finally reached its end, Nathaniel asked the question that had been building inside him since the moment he read the last letter in Julian's office. If the danger had eventually passed, if the organization had eventually been dismantled or scattered, why had Eleanor never come back to him? Why had 20 years continued to pass in silence, even after the threat that justified her absence had disappeared? Vivienne did not answer right away. She looked out toward the street, her jaw tightening slightly. And, for the first time since their conversation began, her composure faltered, replaced by something heavier and more complicated that she clearly did not know how to explain on her mother's behalf. She admitted quietly that she had asked her mother the same question more than once over the years, always receiving the same evasive silence in return, a silence that had grown into its own kind of wall between them. Nathaniel understood, in that moment, that whatever answer existed would have to come directly from Eleanor herself, and that no one else, not Vivienne, not Julian, could offer him the truth he needed most. The meeting Nathaniel had waited 20 years for finally arrived on a gray afternoon, arranged quietly by Vivienne in the back room of a small cafe. Eleanor sometimes visited, a modest space with wooden tables and a window overlooking a quiet side street. When Eleanor walked through the door and saw him sitting there, she stopped completely, her hand still resting on the frame, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the cafe around them fading into irrelevance. There was no embrace, no rush of tears, no dramatic collapse into each other's arms, the way such reunions unfolded in stories people tell themselves to make grief feel more bearable. There was only a silence so dense it seemed to fill the entire room. Two people who had once shared everything now separated by 20 years of unspoken history. Eleanor finally sat across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around a cup of coffee she never drank, the steam rising untouched between them as the silence stretched longer. She told him the truth slowly, piece by piece, admitting that in the earliest years of her disappearance, she had convinced herself that Nathaniel would eventually heal, that he would grieve, and then rebuild a life without her, free from the danger that had once threatened them both. She confessed that as the years passed, the fear of returning grew heavier than the fear of staying away, until she genuinely believed that walking back into his life would only destroy the peace he had somehow managed to construct without her, a peace she had imagined rather than witnessed firsthand. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Years of restrained grief pressing against the surface of his composure. His hands folded tightly on the table in front of him. When she finished speaking, he did not raise his voice or demand an apology, though something in his chest ached with the effort of holding back everything 20 years had built inside him. He simply looked at her, at the face that had haunted every quiet moment of his adult life, and told her that he had never once healed, that he had spent 20 years visiting a grave that held nothing but an empty box, that every year of peace she imagined she had given him had actually been 20 years of a life paused indefinitely, waiting for something he never fully understood he was waiting for. Slowly, without a word, Nathaniel reached down and removed the wedding ring he had worn every single day since the day he believed he lost her. The metal warm from 2 decades against his skin. He placed it gently on the table between them, the small band catching the dim cafe light. A symbol that had meant devotion for 2 decades now transformed into something far more complicated, no longer simple grief, but something tangled with anger and confusion, and a love that refused to be extinguished, despite everything. Eleanor stared at the ring without touching it, tears finally beginning to fall, though neither of them spoke another word before Nathaniel rose from the table and walked out into the gray afternoon alone, leaving her sitting there with the ring untouched in front of her. In the days that followed, Nathaniel disappeared from his usual routines entirely, closing the workshop without explanation and driving through the town they had once shared as young newlyweds, retracing steps he had not walked in 20 years. He visited the small cafe where they had spent their first date, now converted into a bookstore that no longer served coffee, standing outside the window for a long time before finally walking in and buying a book he never read. He walked across the old stone bridge where he had proposed to her one autumn evening, the water beneath it still moving the same way it had 20 years earlier, indifferent to everything that had happened since, carrying leaves downstream the way it always had. He stood for a long time at the train station where he had first seen her again, trying to reconcile the woman he remembered with the stranger he had spoken to in that cafe, the two versions of Eleanor refusing to merge cleanly into one. While Nathaniel wandered through the fragments of their shared past, Eleanor made a decision she had made once before, under similar circumstances, convinced that her presence in his life had only reopened wounds better left closed. Believing that disappearing a second time might spare Nathaniel further pain, she began quietly arranging to leave the country again, contacting old contacts, and preparing documents with the same careful precision Julian had once taught her decades earlier. Vivienne discovered the plan almost by accident, finding a packed suitcase and a set of travel documents hidden beneath her mother's bed, and the discovery ignited an argument between them unlike any they had ever had before. Vivienne insisted that running was no longer protecting anyone, that it had only ever protected Eleanor from having to face what she had done, her voice rising for the first time in years of careful, guarded conversations between them. Nathaniel learned of Eleanor's plan from Vivienne herself, who called him with a shaking voice and told him the flight number and departure time without waiting to be asked, her own fear of losing her mother again, overriding whatever hesitation she might otherwise have felt. He arrived at the airport with barely enough time to think, moving through the crowded terminal with a desperation he had not allowed himself to feel since the day he lost her the first time, weaving between travelers and luggage with single-minded urgency. He found her near the security checkpoint, suitcase in hand, her eyes widening in disbelief as he approached, and for a second time in his life, Nathaniel Cross stood face to face with a woman he refused to lose again, refusing this time to let silence or distance stand between them. He did not raise his voice or plead with her the way desperation might have demanded, though every part of him wanted to. He simply asked her one question, quiet and direct, cutting through everything else that had gone unsaid between them for 20 years, the words carrying more weight than any argument could have carried. He asked whether she still loved him. Eleanor's composure broke completely at those words, the tears she had been holding back for years finally spilling over without restraint, her hands shaking as she set the suitcase down on the terminal floor. For the first time since the train station in the rain, she reached out and pulled him into an embrace that neither of them let go of for a long time. Travelers moving around them, indifferent to the reunion unfolding quietly in the middle of the crowded terminal. Julian Mercer arrived at the airport shortly after, having been called by Vivienne as well, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man finally setting down a burden he had carried for 2 decades. In the quiet aftermath of Eleanor's decision to stay, he finally revealed the full truth he had carried for 2 decades, standing a short distance away as though giving the reunited family space they had earned. The organization that once threatened Eleanor's life had been dismantled years earlier through a federal investigation, its leadership arrested, its operations permanently dissolved. The danger that had shaped Eleanor's entire life for 2 decades simply ceasing to exist without anyone telling her clearly enough for her to believe it. There had been no danger left for years, Julian admitted, only fear that had calcified into habit, a fear he now regretted helping to sustain for so long after it stopped serving any real purpose. His voice heavy with an apology he had been rehearsing silently for longer than he cared to admit. He explained that somewhere along the way, protecting Eleanor had become indistinguishable from simply keeping her hidden, and that he had failed to recognize the difference until it was almost too late to matter. Standing in that terminal, surrounded by strangers moving in every direction, Nathaniel turned toward Vivienne, who had followed her mother to the airport without hesitation, her own eyes rimmed red from tears she had not bothered to hide. He looked at her carefully, at the eyes that mirrored his own so precisely, and for the first time in her entire life, he spoke a word she had never once heard directed at her before. He called her his daughter, quietly, almost as though testing whether the word would hold, watching her face for any sign that it might be too much, too soon, too strange after 22 years of absence. Something in Vivienne's expression softened into a kind of relief she had not realized she was still waiting for. A lifetime of unspoken longing, finally acknowledged in a single, simple word spoken aloud in the middle of a crowded airport. The workshop reopened not long after, the bell above the door ringing again on a cold morning. Though this time Nathaniel did not work alone. Eleanor sat beside him at the long wooden counter, learning the careful mechanics of clock restoration with the same patience she had once shown in every letter she never sent, her fingers slowly growing familiar with tools she had never touched before. Customers who remembered Nathaniel's solitary habits noticed the change immediately, though most were too polite to ask directly, offering only quiet, knowing smiles as they left their broken watches on the counter between them. Amelia Rowan, who had loved Nathaniel quietly for years without ever expecting anything in return, found her own peace in the change as well, choosing friendship over what might have been, and continuing to visit the workshop simply because she valued the people inside it. Vivienne moved into an apartment only a few blocks away, close enough to visit on weekends, close enough that the distance which once defined their entire relationship no longer meant anything at all. She continued her work at the museum, though she began stopping by the workshop most evenings after closing, sitting on the old stool near the window while her parents worked, sometimes helping, sometimes simply watching, learning slowly what an ordinary family evening was supposed to feel like. There were no strange titles exchanged between them anymore, no careful avoidance of words like mother or father or daughter. Only the quiet, ordinary language of a family finally allowed to exist without secrecy, conversations that no longer required careful editing or half-truths. One evening, working alone after Eleanor and Vivienne had already left for the day, Nathaniel opened a drawer he had avoided for 20 years and removed the wedding clock, the one he and Eleanor had received on their wedding day, its mechanism frozen at the exact hour their old life had supposedly ended. He worked on it carefully through the night, replacing worn gears, cleaning dust from components that had not moved in 2 decades, his hands steady despite everything his heart was carrying, the workshop silent except for the small, precise sounds of tools against metal. When he finally wound the mechanism and released it, the hands began to move again for the first time in 20 years, ticking quietly forward into a future that no longer required waiting. The small sound filling the empty workshop like a heartbeat finally restarted. On a mild afternoon near the end of autumn, the three of them walked together through the same train station, where everything had first unraveled, the platform where a stranger's face had once seemed impossible now simply familiar, worn smooth by ordinary use rather than haunted by grief. Nathaniel held Eleanor's hand as they walked, the ring returned to his finger where it belonged, its familiar weight no longer a symbol of loss but of something rebuilt more carefully than before. Vivienne walked beside them without needing to be told where to stand, her presence no longer something quietly negotiated, but simply, naturally, a part of the family moving forward together. None of them spoke as they crossed the platform, the silence between them no longer heavy with everything left unsaid, but light in the way silence becomes when nothing truly needs saying anymore. Somewhere above them, a train whistle sounded once into the cooling air, and the sound carried outward across the platform like something finally, quietly, allowed to arrive, echoing off the old stone walls that had witnessed both the ending and the beginning of the same story. Some people spend their entire lives waiting for a miracle to find them, believing that healing must come from somewhere outside themselves, some external force capable of undoing what time and fear had broken. But sometimes, the miracle was never something arriving from the outside at all. Sometimes, it was simply someone brave enough, after everything, to finally come home.